wisdom,
prudentia,
justice,
justitia,
temperance,
temperantia,
courage.
fortitudo.
Applying ancient philosophy to modern life, this is the Sunday Stoic.
I'm very happy to be coming on as a guest host for the Sunday Stoic podcast. My name is Greg Sadler. Some of you probably know me as the editor of Stoicism Today. I've also been on the Sunday Stoic podcast once before, and I do a good bit of work, you can say, on Stoicism. So I thought this would be an excellent opportunity for me to do a little thinking and sharing my reflections with you about something that I've been thinking about and exploring for quite some time and talking with a number of people about, whether it's in small groups or through videos and other media like podcasts or through emails and social media. And that has to do with the nature of Stoic wisdom. Or let's say the connection between Stoic wisdom and reading and study. I'm going to be using several letters from Seneca here, which embody a certain sort of perspective on Stoicism and how we should understand it. And those are letters 33, 94, and 95. The text that I'm using is the recent translation by Margaret Graver and Anthony Long, Seneca's Letters on Ethics, but you can find these in all sorts of other translations and formats and under other titles as well. My big hope is that all of you listening will be spurred to read or reread these letters and to take on what they have to say about Stoicism as a philosophy, as opposed to what we might call Stoicism light, where it gets reduced down to sound bites or quotes, or even to what Seneca himself is going to call precepts, which are better than just memes or sound bites. So what I'm going to be doing here is really making a case or making an argument using Seneca in two different ways. The first way is by, you might say, extracting some of the important ideas and thoughts out of those letters. And I think as we go through them, you'll see just how rich and how insightful these actually are. The second way is to use Seneca by way of illustration. He's not just a great author who has a lot of things to say that we can mine out of his works and then refine into valuable Stoic insights. He is one of those very Stoic authors that I'm going to make the case we need to go back to and read and reread over and over again. I am going to try to keep this relatively short. I don't want to take up your ear space and head space for hours and hours on end, although I think you could do that with commentary coming out of these particular three letters, correlating it to other Stoic texts and ideas and practices. We're going to try to keep it succinct. We're going to try to keep it fairly short, and we're going to leave a lot of threads not entirely tied up so that you can yourself take them up and do some of the things that we're going to be talking about in just a few moments. Here's the general case that I want to make to you, and we'll see how convincing it is by the end of this. Maybe some of you will be listening to this and giving all of the things I have to say the benefit of the doubt and then say, nah, not really for me. Others among you might say, well, this is actually a set of really helpful ideas. Maybe I need to change what I'm doing in my Stoic practice or deepen it or incorporate new things. And some of you may take this as confirmation of precisely what you're already doing. So here's my basic point. Here's the thing I'm putting forward. If you want to really understand Stoicism well, and if you want to see your Stoic practice flourishing, if you want to acquire the virtues at some point or another, you really do need to spend time reading Stoic texts and going beyond any sort of minimalism or I'm just going to do practice or I like these quotes over here, but I'm not going to read things in a more studious and systematic way. That's not to say, of course, that there's nothing good about doing all these other things that are connected with Stoicism. But I really do want to stress this case that without systematic study, you're missing something. You're losing out on something. And it's irrational to do that because it's something that is clearly there, that so many people have talked about, including in the Stoic literature. So it would be, in a certain respect, a kind of foolishness to denigrate study or to forego it for oneself. And of course, as Stoics, we know that foolishness or folly, if you want an older translation, is the opposite of wisdom. It's not just a opposite in the sense of like a lack of wisdom. It's actually a vice. If wisdom is a virtue, something that as Stoics we think matters very highly, we ought to be seeking wisdom and we ought to try to take it on and incorporate it wherever we're going to find it. And Seneca is really actually a great example of that. You notice that in writing to Lucilius, who's a friend of his and who has been influenced by the Epicureans, he's even willing to take things from not just Epicurus, but also from Lucretius, who he mentions in one of these letters. So before we jump in and start deriving some of the wisdom that is communicated in these letters, looking closely at a few sections and passages from them, I'd like to say two main things. So the first thing, going off of this idea that by studying Stoic texts, and I'm going to talk about which Stoic texts in particular a little bit later on in this podcast. By studying Stoic texts, we are helping to develop a disposition, a virtue, a habit of wisdom, a complex one within ourselves. And if we ask, well, what does wisdom consist in? The Stoics are very consistent about this. It doesn't just mean figuring out what's good for us and how to get it. It also involves rooting out fake or false ideas, things that are not productive for us. It involves self-scrutiny, getting to understand not just human nature, but our own individual natures. And reading philosophical texts is one of the means to that end. I'll say a few things about this. I mean, we could actually spend an entire episode on how to read a philosophical text productively. But I'll say this to begin with. Reading a philosophical text is never a one and done sort of process. I have been reading, studying, teaching texts not just from the Stoics, but also by other important philosophical movements and schools and thinkers, in some cases now for several decades. And I go back to them and I still find more stuff there. Sometimes things that I missed on the first or second or 20th pass, sometimes ideas that when they are put into connection with other ideas, they take on a new meaning and depth and resonance and are able to be applied within the scope of my life. There's all sorts of ways in which classic philosophical texts are productive. And the great Stoic texts that we have, Epictetus's Discourses, Aurelius's Meditations, Seneca's Letters, and so many other works by Seneca as well as other works that we're going to look at towards the end of this, all of those are productive in that way. They should never be looked at as, well, I'm going to read Epictetus's Enchiridion and then I'll be done with it. I'll have mastered it. You don't master Stoic texts. So that means that you need to go back to them over and over again. It should be part of a regular process of study. The other thing to say about doing this practice of routine study, and when I say routine, I don't mean it should be humdrum or boring or anything like that. It means that you should be doing it on a routine basis. You should be reading things not just when you can carve out the little space of time, but make some time during the day, say, to read Seneca. Do it in a, regular, systematic way. When you do that, then you develop the things that Epictetus talks about over and over again, saying, have this ready at hand. Have a concept, have a distinction, have an analogy, have something useful for you that you can apply when you encounter the difficulties, when you run into emotions that get out of whack for yourself, when you have something happen to you that cognitively you know you should not really react in the way that you are, but emotively or affectively you still are, when there's that disconnect. Have all these things ready to hand. How do you have them ready at hand? By reading, by stocking up your mind. I'll actually mention something that doesn't come from the Stoics directly. It comes from medieval monks. They talked about reading as ruminating, and they were using the analogy of like a cow chewing its cud. You digest things, and a cow is a great example here because the digestion process is not as simple as it is for us humans, where we shove things in our mouth and it goes down after we've chewed it, hopefully enough, and it goes into our stomach and then goes through our intestines and we derive some things from it, right? No, the cow is a complex process going over and over again and going from stomach to stomach and chewing it some more. Well, that's what we ought to be doing with classic texts. That's what they offer to us as possibilities. The other thing that I'm going to point out before we look at these letters is that there are a variety of reasons, or rather rationalizations, because they're really, when it comes down to it, excuses rather than valid lines of reasoning, why people shouldn't spend time reading classic Stoic texts. So, some people will say, oh, I don't want to do an academic degree in Stoicism. I just want to have something useful for my life. And, this is reflective of a common misconception, which is, to begin with, not that many academics are actually focused on Stoicism. If you go into a philosophy program, you may have a hard time getting anyone to actually read Stoics with you. But even let's say that you do. Are the academics really that detached from ordinary life? This is a common misconception about the relationship between academic philosophy, some of which can be very abstract, and lived experience. Some kinds of academic philosophy are very detached from our ordinary lives. Stoicism is not. And you get to find that out by actually spending time reading them. So telling somebody right off the bat, oh, I don't want to read Seneca because he's an academic. Actually, Seneca wasn't an academic. Seneca was a working guy who advised, an emperor and did a whole bunch of other things on the side. By the way, his works were read by working people throughout history, and that's why we have them today, including monks who kept copying him out and did so in time when they were devoted to that sort of activity. They also read him when they could, and they did so because there was something valuable there for everybody. So this whole concern about, I don't want to get into an academic study of it, is really misguided. It's a lot of cart before the horse. You don't know whether it's an academic study until you actually read the people and realize that they're not just coming at philosophy or life from detached academic perspectives. Other people will say things like, well, Stoicism is really much more about practice than it is about reading books or studying, or I don't want to engage in a theoretical activity just for its own sake. And again, the Stoics would say, when you read their texts, we're not engaging in a theoretical activity just for its own sake. We're actually engaging in a theoretical activity so that we can apply it. The philosophy is the art of life for the Stoics, as for so many other ancient philosophers. And you can't do Stoic practice effectively in most cases without some guidance. I mean, if you happen to just do things the right way, you're basically getting lucky. And Seneca himself talks about that, by the way, in letter 95. He says there are some people who can just sort of temperamentally wind up doing things right, but why would you deprive yourself of the opportunity to actually understand in a more systematic and profound way what it is that you've been getting right? And the fact that you've been getting things right for a little while doesn't mean that you're guaranteed to get them right in the future. It's far better to be equipped and armed with some actual knowledge that has stood the test of time, which you are perfectly capable of taking on and accepting, sort of like taking the baton that's being passed to you in a relay race from these people who came before. Another thing that I run into quite often in discussion groups are people who say, oh, I don't really want to read Seneca or Marcus Aurelius. Can't I just read some contemporary literature, something popular about Stoicism? And the answer is, yeah, you can read whatever you want. It's a free country, it's a free world. But you're not going to get out of that the same thing that you would out of engaging in these classic texts and thinkers. I mean, there's a couple issues with this. It's the same issue that comes up with respect to translation. How do you know a translation is any good? Well, if you can read the original language, you go to the original language and you check it against the translation. And if the translation is kind of out of whack and getting words wrong and misleading people, you're like, well, that's not a good translation. How do you know that the popular authors who are presenting Stoicism, particularly if it's in simplified forms, Stoicism made easy, are actually getting Stoicism right? You've got to go back to the original texts and thinkers and do a bit of comparative work. So if you want to be assured that you're getting the real stuff, even if it is in modern lingo and new examples and sort of a reinterpretation, you've got to know something about classical Stoicism. Otherwise, you're just taking somebody's word that they're actually giving you the real stuff. When people say these sorts of things, I don't think that they realize that from a classic Stoic perspective, these stances reflect fears and desires. They reflect emotional commitments and responses that then guide their rationalization rather than, a full rational approach to these things. They are in effect what the Stoics would call the rational or ruling part. They're taking that part and they're messing it up in ways that might be just for the moment, or they might reflect habits. And these are, in fact, ways in which people get in their own way. They impede themselves. They hold themselves back from something that they could have. And that's really what is problematic about this. I mean, we don't have to shame people because they're not spending time reading, or say that if you're not reading, you're not a real Stoic or something like that. Again, it's a free country. Anyone can read or not read whatever they want to. And Stoicism is not a rigid orthodoxy or a club that we have membership rules in or anything like that. But if you want to get the most out of it, there's no good reason to be not reading classic Stoic texts. I suppose there could be one good reason, which is, your life is too busy and you can't make any time for that. That's debatable, but, let's extend the benefit of the doubt to people who claim that. But if you do have some breathing room, if you do have time to, say, watch things on Netflix or to scroll through social media, you actually have time to read Marcus Aurelius or Seneca or even people like Cicero. I know that there are some people, because they've communicated this to me, who say, oh, I'm not smart enough to read this sort of stuff. I can't really approach it myself. And the answer is actually you are smart enough. You can always get something out of philosophical texts. You may not master the entirety of it in your first sitting, which is totally unrealistic anyway, even for people who've been studying philosophy for years and years and years. When people say that they've done that sort of thing, you know that they've missed out on quite a bit. Everybody is able to take philosophical texts and get something out of it. And it's like exercising with weights. When you walk into the gym for the first time, you're not going to go over and start pressing massive amounts of iron. You have to work your way up. And if you do put in the time, if you do put in the work, if you get past, I suppose the analogy to the pain and toil of lifting weights would be the pain and toil of reading passages in books that you don't fully understand and feeling whatever it is that you feel because of that. If you plow through that, it gets easier. Your muscles, if we want to use this analogy some more, the muscles of your mind get stronger, more toned, more able to take on these burdens and to overcome them. Now, that's a lot of preamble before actually looking at these promised 3 letters that we're going to do. So letter 33, letter 94, letter 95. And again, we can't get into the totality of these because I do want this to be short enough to be listenable. But what's going on in these letters? What are we picking up on? So in letter 33, Seneca starts out by talking to this friend of his, Lucilius, and he says, "You request I should close these letters as I did the earlier ones with quotations, and that I should take them from the leaders of our own school, that is the Stoics." And so what is Lucilius asking him for? He's asking him for what today we call quotes, or were called in previous times maxims or precepts. Just a little bit later in the letter, he talks about Lucilius demanding excerpts and quotations, and so that's excerpta et repetita in the Latin. So what are these? These are little bits of Stoic writing that is plucked out of its context so that somebody can keep it in mind. Somebody can maybe put it into a tattoo or find a nice picture of Epictetus, hopefully Epictetus and not Epicurus, and then paste it into, Facebook or Twitter with that quote attached to it. Letters 94 and 95, which are considerably longer. As a matter of fact, Seneca actually says, "I'm going to impose on you a big old letter." That's not the translation, of course, in the text, but that's how I'm going to translate it here. In those letters, Seneca is getting into some really serious methodology stuff when it comes to philosophy, and Stoic philosophy in particular. So he begins letter 94 by saying, "Some people have deemed only one part of philosophy legitimate, the part that, instead of instructing human beings in general, gives specific precepts for each social role, such as advising a husband on how he should behave to his wife, a father on how to raise his children, or a master on how to regulate his slaves. They've rejected the other parts for straying beyond our actual needs." And then he talks about Aristo, who was, he was a Stoic, and actually Seneca calls him a Stoic here, but he was kind of an unconventional Stoic. If you want to know more about Aristo, there's plenty of information available. We'll just say this. He thought that you need to focus just on the most fundamental parts of philosophy and not get involved with all this other extraneous stuff. And so in a way, he's not really fitting in that well with the Stoics. But Seneca says the Stoic Aristo judges this part of precepts to be of little weight, incapable of sinking right into the mind, being nothing but advice from old people. And he says the greatest help comes from the actual principles of philosophy and the structure of the ultimate good. So what we've got there is a contrast between people wanting to take Stoicism and simplify it and say, we're just going to do, Stoicism for this kind of situation or person, and we're not going to worry about all the big doctrines or, how the system itself fits together. You don't actually need that sort of stuff. And then Aristo comes along and says, no, as a matter of fact, it's totally opposite. What you need is the system, the key ideas, the principles themselves of the philosophy, and all that other stuff you can sort out later on. It's not really that important. And Seneca's going to come along and say, well, no, it's actually both. You need precepts. They serve an important role. Aristo, you've got that wrong. But you can't just have those. And what's really interesting is that he continues this in letter 95. You see that for Seneca, he wants to say we need as many resources as possible in order to do Stoic philosophy well, which means to do it within the context of our lives. Let's go back to letter 33. So Lucilius is asking him for a bunch of quotes, or in an earlier translation, maxim. Seneca says, you don't really need to demand these. We can find these without, as he says, intermission in the writings of our school. meaning that if you go to actual Stoic texts, now, of course, we've lost a lot of the ones that are being referred to there by Seneca. Unfortunately, we don't have all the Stoic literature of antiquity, but the stuff that we do have actually does seem to fit this. He says that we don't have the eye catchers you have in mind. With us, the buyers are not disappointed by entering the shop and finding nothing more than was hung up outside. We let them choose the display items from any point in the text they happen to prefer. Just suppose we did want to separate a few individual sayings from the throng. Who should we attribute them to? We're not under a monarch. Each of us asserts his own freedom. And we have all these wonderful resources that you can find within the classic Stoic text. As a matter of fact, there's no point in singling out individual passages because they're within a context in which there's so many other great passages. So he says, if you're going to insist, I won't be stingy with you, but I'll deal them out by the fistful. There's piles of these quotes lying around. One has only to pick them up. There's no need to collect them. They come not by drips and drabs, but in a steady flow, all interconnected. So what is he saying there? He's saying that when we go to actual Stoic writings, we have an embarrassment of riches. We don't have to excerpt single things out of there. You can spend time reading through these great thinkers, and there's going to be so much there that you can use that you've almost got more than you can bring home, more than you can handle at any given time. He says two other things in this letter that I think are really quite important. And he's, in usual Seneca way, kind of jumbling them all up together. So he tells us, I'm sure that these, meaning these quotes, these passages, these maxims taken out of context, do a great deal for beginners and for what he calls listeners from outside the school, people who aren't really into Stoicism but are kind of, interested in it. They want to see what's there. Individual sayings, he says, take hold more easily when they're isolated and rounded off like bits of verse. And we might say today, there's so much more eye-catching when you, like I said, put them into a meme where you have the quote, oftentimes not accurately sourced and sometimes mistranslated, but that's a whole different subject matter, right? So you've got the quote and then you put it on some nice background and then maybe put Epictetus or Seneca or somebody else's bust or, a picture of them. And that's eye-catching. That's really easy to keep in mind. There's nothing wrong with doing these sorts of things. As Seneca says, these are great for children. These are great for beginners. These are great for people from outside the school. These are what the Greeks call rhei. And he says they are what a child's mind is able to encompass, not yet having room for anything larger. And that should be how we look at these matters, right? Are we children? Are our minds not able to encompass anything larger? Probably not the case for all of us at this point in time. So we probably should go beyond just these maxims or quotes or precepts. The other thing that he's telling us in this letter is that we need to learn how to make these things our own. We need to interpret them, as he says. We need to incorporate them. We shouldn't just have them be ready-at-hand tools. They need to become part of who we are. And so he goes on and he says, it's shameful when a person who's making definite progress seizes on flowery bits or props himself up with a handful of commonplaces he's memorized. Let him stand on his own feet. And he talks about these people who are never authors, but always interpreters, concealing themselves in the shadow of another. And you might say, well, doesn't that go against this idea of studying? No, you study precisely so that you can get yourself to the point where you can depart and you can say, yeah, I get what Seneca's saying here. And I think he's right about a whole bunch of things. And I think he's also, off base on these things over here. And I've got good reasons for that. That's what studying classic Stoic texts, if you put in the work, the time, the thought, the discipline, will eventually get you to. Now, in letters 94 and 95, Seneca's no longer using this language of excerpts. Instead, he's talking about precepts. And, are these exactly the same thing? No, not exactly, although they cover a lot of the same ground. So, when you see handy little phrases, he gives examples like the saying of Cato, don't buy what you can use, but what you need. For what you cannot use, a penny is too high a price, or be sparing with time, or know yourself, or when wrongs are done, forgetting it is the cure. All these sorts of things are what he calls precepts. And we have a very large number of these circulating around that come from Seneca or from Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius. You find a little passage in their work that you like and you write it into a book, and now you've got a precept. In letter 94, Seneca first begins by looking at all of the points that Aristo has to say. And this is actually great because we don't have Aristo's writings. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to say this as a bit of a side note. When you study Seneca and you look at his letters, you're not just reading Seneca, you're also reading the people who he has studied and is responding to and provides summaries of, and sometimes entire quotations from their works. So it's not just reading Seneca, you're also, you might say, part of a conversation where Seneca is speaking in other people's voices. Now, after summarizing all of Aristo's arguments why precepts are totally useless to us, Seneca says, I'm going to take each of these on in turn and say why we should actually care more about these precepts than Aristo thinks that we should. And in doing so, he doesn't just knock down Aristo's arguments, he also explains to us how we should look at these precepts or quotations. I'm not going to go through every single one of the points that Seneca makes because that would make for a much longer episode, obviously, and probably overwhelm you. You can go to the text and read it yourself, and I highly encourage you to do so. One of the points that Seneca makes, this is in section 25 of letter 94, Aristo says, what's the use of showing the obvious? Why, if we already understand Stoicism, why would we need these quotes, these precepts? They're just telling us what we already know. And Seneca says, well, we all need reminders sometimes. He says, we don't always apply our knowledge. A reminder does not teach, but it does call attention. It arouses us, focuses the memory, and prevents it from slipping away. And so he tells us, we overlook many things that are before our eyes. Reminding is one form of exhortation. So these precepts can be quite useful, but they're really, notice reading between the lines, they're more useful when we have something that goes beyond just a bunch of precepts, when we actually have been studying Stoic philosophy and we have sort of a systematic conception of it in our mind. Then it can be incredibly helpful to have these reminders as ways of focusing our attention, of recalling us out of where we might be slipping or not sufficiently attending to things, to looking at things in the proper light. There's another point that he makes a little bit later on that also shows us the connection between precepts or passages or quotes and other important aspects of Stoic philosophy and practice. He says, the opponent says philosophy is divided into the following parts: knowledge and mental disposition. The person who's learned and perceived what to do is not yet wise, not until his mind has been transformed into the things learned. Your third part, the one that consists of precepts, is merely derived from the other two, the cognitive principles and the mental disposition. It's superfluous. The other two parts are sufficient to instill virtue. And then Seneca says, oh, really? Is that the case? If that was true, then this line of reasoning would also make other things superfluous, like consolation. You notice that Seneca has written letters of consolation to people. It would also make admonition and persuasion and even proof. all of those would become superfluous. And Seneca is saying, but they're not. We actually do work on these sorts of things. This is part of the fabric of a real practical philosophy. What's he doing there? He's telling us how these different things ought to be interconnected. We do, in fact, need to have something more systematic than just a bunch of quotes to work with. We need also the development of habits, the development of discipline. But we also need these things that he calls consolation and exhortation, the rhetorical or dramatic element of things. That's how Stoicism becomes, you might say, to use a different terminology, existential and experiential. That's how it has its rooting in the lives of the people that we actually are. In letter 95, Seneca takes up a lot of these points again, but he goes a little bit deeper with some of them. So I'm just going to mention, again, a few passages, a few points from this letter and suggest that you go and read it and check it out and see what's actually there. There's this great passage in letter 95, and this is in section 9 and 10, and kind of going into section 11 and 12 as well, where he tells us that many arts, including the most refined, have their own principles as well as their precepts. So this is two different kinds of things, right? Principles are much more general. They're part of a systematic approach to things. We get them out of study, reading. They're, you could say, theoretical. Precepts are much more specific. They're practical, right? So he goes on and he says, this is true, for example, of medicine, where there are the different branches of Hippocrates, the Asclepiades, and Themeson. And then he goes on and says, no theoretical art is without its own principles. The Greeks call these dogmata. We can call them principles, decreta, tenets, skita, that is things to be known, or doctrines, plakita. And then he says, you'll find these in geometry and astronomy. But you'll also find this in philosophy. Why? Because philosophy is both theoretical and practical, observing at the same time as it acts. It would be a mistake for you to think that philosophy only looks after your mundane, your day-to-day needs. It has loftier aspirations. Rather, it declares, my focus is the entire universe. I don't confine myself to the mortal domain, content to give you positive or negative advice. I am summoned by things that are mighty and stationed above you. And then he brings up Lucretius, who is an Epicurean poet. So he goes on and he says, philosophy, by being theoretical, has its own principles. But then he goes on and says, no one will properly do what he should without being endowed with the reasoning that enables him to fulfill the measures of duty in every situation. He will not maintain those measures if he's acquired precepts that are applicable only to the situation at hand and not universally. Now, listen to this metaphor, which is quite interesting. The former, that is, precepts that are not connected with principles, are inherently weak and rootless, as it were, because they're merely partial. It is principles that can fortify us, maintain us in safety and tranquility, and simultaneously embrace the whole of our life and the whole of nature. The difference between philosophy's principles and its precepts is the same as that between the basic elements of something and its branches. The latter depend on the former, which are both their causes and the causes of everything. So he's taking a very strong stance there, isn't he? He's telling us that if you want your Stoicism to be genuine Stoicism, if you want it to fulfill the promises of Stoicism, you have to go beyond just the sound bites. You have to go beyond just reading selected passages. You have to go beyond just getting things at second hand. You need to go to the straight dope, as we used to say way back in the day. There really is no effective replacement for studying the Stoic texts that we are fortunate enough to have at our disposal. Those are the places where you are going to find the principles, and you're not going to just find them, one at a time. You're going to find them put together in a kind of complex net, or if you like, they're stars within a very complex constellation. And the more of them that you have, and the more that you see how they form, as Seneca loves to say, a contexture, a continuous system, the more your Stoicism is going to be able to use those precepts that you're getting from here and there in the text, the more that you'll be able to use those things that are ready at hand, the more they'll actually be ready at hand for you so that you can rise to the challenges and obstacles and difficulties of your day-to-day life. So I've already taken up quite a bit of your time doing this guest hosting. I'm going to bring this to a close by saying, once again, that you definitely want to read classic Stoic texts. And then somebody might say, okay, you've got me. I am convinced. I've read some classic Stoic texts, but what should I be reading? Well, there's always the big three, as we call them, right? Seneca, who we have a lot of works of. We also have Epictetus. You can read his discourses as well as the Enchiridion. Unfortunately, it seems as if we've lost some of the discourses, but, what we've got is some pretty excellent stuff. And then there's Marcus Aurelius. His meditations are great. I would say they're best understood by reading him along with reading Epictetus and Seneca. There's also two philosophers who you might not know that well, but whose works are available, and that's Musonius Rufus, the teacher of Epictetus, and Heracles, who we get some other interesting ideas from. You can also check out Diogenes Laertes' Lives of the Philosophers. Book 7 has a summary of Stoic doctrine in it. Arius Didymus has an epitome of Stoic doctrine that's well worth reading. Those can be a little bit tough to work with because they're more like saying, here's what the Stoics say about this and this and this and this and this and this. And it's like very rapid fire without a lot of explanation. But another author who you definitely want to be reading if you want to know more about Stoicism and from reliable sources is Cicero, who is not himself a Stoic. As a matter of fact, he identified with the academic skeptic school, but he's really an eclectic who takes on a lot of Stoic ideas and who presents them in what we can say are pretty faithful ways. So, On Ends, or On Moral Ends sometimes it's called. That's a great book to look at. On Duties is another one, sometimes also translated as On Moral Duties or On Appropriate Actions. And there's other works by Cicero as well. He has a book called The Stoic Paradoxes, which is quite short, which is worth checking out. And through reading these things, you are filling your mind with all of these precepts and principles that will be useful for you in studying Stoicism. And as you do that, you're connecting them, hopefully, with some practical action, with developing new habits, specifically those of the virtues, and moving away from those of the vices. You're engaging in self-reflection, figuring out how what these authors have to say bears upon you and your life and your relationships and how you think things through. They also provide us with helpful analogies and role models and instances and examples of right actions. So when you put all these things together, you have something that is quite powerful and something that you have to return to over and over and over again. And when I say have to, here's what I want to close on. It's not a obligation like, well, if you don't do that, you're not a good Stoic. They're going to take away your Stoic card. No, this is something where as you do it, as you invest yourself in this continual practice of reading and engaging classic Stoic texts and thinkers, things will change for you. What was originally difficult and something that you didn't want to do, you will find yourself wanting to return to it. Your desires will change. Your aversions will change. And that will change your choices and your habits and your mindset over time. There'll come a time for you, I can promise you, if you put in the work, that at least with one of these Stoic authors, you will come to crave having time to read them and engage in a kind of conversation with them and think about what it is that they have to say. I'm going to bring this to a close by thanking Steve for having me guest host on the Sunday Stoic. It's quite an honor to be here, and hopefully at least some of you will spend a bit more time reading classic Stoic texts. I don't know if my argument here, drawn largely from Seneca, is convincing to too many of you. If there's any fault, it's not really on Seneca's side. It's probably more on my own. So I'm going to bid all of you goodbye, and hopefully we'll be on the Sunday Stoic some other time in the future.